I returned from my wife's grave on a Tuesday afternoon, and my son was sitting in my living room like he owned the place. That image, him leaning back in my recliner, feet up on the coffee table I built with my own hands 30 years ago, a beer sweating a ring onto the wood. That's the image that still comes to me sometimes at 3 in the morning. Not the worst part of what happened, just the beginning of it. The moment I should have understood exactly what kind of man my son had become. But I didn't. Not yet. Let me back up. My name is Leland. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer before I retired, and for most of those years I was the kind of father who showed up. Little league games in the rain, science fairs, parent-teacher conferences where the teacher would say my son Garrett was bright but unfocused, and I would nod and take notes and drive home thinking about how to help him find his focus. I was present. I was involved. Looking back, I wonder if that was part of the problem. My wife Dolores passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, that's how fast it moves. She was the center of our family in ways I didn't fully appreciate until she was gone. She was the one who knew when Garrett was struggling before he said a word. She was the one who kept the peace, made the holidays feel like something worth driving home for. After she died, things between Garrett and me got strained. I don't know a better word for it. We were polite to each other in the way that strangers are polite, carefully, without warmth. Garrett was 31 when his mother died. He had a decent job in sales, nothing spectacular, but enough to live on. He was married to a woman named Blythe, who I tried to like and mostly managed to tolerate. Blythe came from money. Her father, a man named Thatcher, who wore linen shirts and had opinions about wine, and she had never quite adjusted to the fact that Garrett's income wasn't what her upbringing had prepared her to expect from a husband, so they spent more than they made. That's the short version. Garrett called me about 8 months after Dolores passed. He needed a loan, he said, just to get through a rough patch. His company had restructured. His commission structure had changed, and they were behind on the mortgage. He said the number quietly, like he was embarrassed. $18,000. I wired it the next day. I told myself that's what Dolores would have wanted. I told myself a lot of things in those early months that I stopped telling myself later. 6 months after that, he called again. Different number this time. Not a loan, he said. More of a gift if I could manage it. He and Blythe were trying to have a baby, and the fertility treatments weren't covered by his insurance, and it was expensive, and they really wanted this. $10,000. I sent it. 2 years of this. Different amounts, different reasons. Medical bills, car repairs, a flooded basement, their homeowner's insurance disputed. I stopped counting after 60,000. I told myself I was helping my son. I told myself Dolores would have done the same. What I didn't tell myself was the thing I should have seen clearly. Every time I helped, the next call came faster. Now, the house. When Dolores and I were in our 40s, we bought a small fishing cabin in northern Minnesota, up near Elle, on the edge of the Boundary Waters. It wasn't much when we bought it. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a dock that needed replacing every few years. But we fixed it up slowly, summer by summer. New floors, a proper kitchen, a sunroom facing the lake that Dolores designed herself on graph paper at the kitchen table. I put in every nail. She chose every color. After she died, that cabin became the place I went to breathe. I'd drive up alone in September when the leaves were turning and the lake was going quiet, and I'd stay 2 or 3 weeks and fish and read and not talk to anyone, and something in me would settle back into place. It was the closest I came to feeling like myself again. I had not told Garrett the entry code. I had told him when he asked about the cabin once that I wasn't ready to share that space with anyone yet. He said he understood. He nodded in that way he had of nodding that I used to think meant agreement and later realized meant only acknowledgement. I heard you, not I respect what you said. So when I pulled up to the cabin on a Friday evening in late September, the light going gold over the water, the aspens already turned, everything exactly as I'd been picturing it for weeks, and saw 3 unfamiliar cars in the driveway, I sat in my truck for a long moment before I got out. 2 were SUVs I didn't recognize. One was Garrett's Tahoe. I went to the front door and it swung open before I could reach for the handle. Blythe's mother was standing there. Her name is Roberta. She is a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-60s who has never liked me, and the feeling has been mutual and professional. We have always managed a surface-level courtesy at holidays. What she was doing standing in the doorway of my cabin in Minnesota was beyond my capacity to process in the first few seconds. She said, "Can I help you?" Just like that. Can I help you? In my own cabin, at my own door. I said, "Where's Garrett?" Something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly, more like recalculation. She stepped back and called into the cabin, "Garrett, there's someone at the door." I heard footsteps, and then my son appeared in the hallway. My hallway, the one I put tongue and groove pine on myself, wearing a flannel shirt I didn't recognize, and an expression that took me a half second to identify. Caught. He looked caught. And then, almost immediately, the expression changed into something harder. He said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" "Not Dad, I can explain." "Not Dad, I'm so sorry. What are you doing here?" I looked past him into the cabin. Blythe's father, Thatcher, was visible through the kitchen doorway, pouring himself something from a bottle on the counter. My bottle of scotch I'd left there in the cabinet. There were coats on the hooks by the door that weren't mine. A pair of women's boots I didn't recognize on the mat. The cabin smelled like someone else's cooking. I said, "I came up for my September trip like I do every year." Garrett said, "You should have called." I want you to sit with that for a moment because I had to. You should have called. To be told I should have called before coming to a property I own, that I pay the taxes on, that I have held the deed to for 22 years. I said, "Garrett, how long have you been here?" He looked at the floor for just a moment. "About 10 days. "And how did you get in?" I knew the code. "No," I said, "you didn't." He shifted his weight. He had changed the code. He admitted it, not with words, but with the particular silence of a man who has no good answer and has decided to wait out the question. My son had changed the code on my cabin. Blythe appeared behind him then. She had the decency to look uncomfortable, which was more than her parents managed. Roberta had retreated to the kitchen and was talking to Thatcher in a low voice. I heard the word complicated. I walked past Garrett into the living room, my cabin, my furniture. Blythe's sister, a younger woman whose name I could never remember, was curled on the couch with a book. There was a child's drawing on the kitchen table, though Garrett and Blythe don't have children yet, which meant someone had brought their kids. Someone had brought their entire family to my cabin for what appeared to be an extended vacation. I counted 7 people. 7. I stood in the middle of my living room, and the room felt entirely warm, and I understood for the first time in my life what it means when people talk about a place being taken from you. Garrett followed me in. He was doing the thing he always did when he was defensive, standing very straight, talking a little too calmly like he was being reasonable, and I was the one making things difficult. He said, "We needed somewhere to go, Dad. Blythe's parents were visiting, and the house is small, and we figured the cabin was just sitting empty." I said, "It's not yours." He said, "I know it's not mine. You changed the code." I needed to change it because Blythe's dad accidentally, Garrett. I said his name quietly. I have learned over 64 years that quiet is more effective than loud. "Stop." He stopped. I said, "Did you ask me if you could bring 7 people to my cabin?" Silence. "Did you call me ever in the last 10 days to mention you were here?" Silence. Did you at any point think to ask? Blythe put her hand on his arm. Roberta had come back into the doorway of the kitchen and was watching with an expression I can only describe as irritated, as though I were the one creating a disruption in her weekend. Garrett said, "Dad, I didn't think you'd mind," and there it was, the sentence that had defined our relationship for years. I didn't think you'd mind. When he put a dent in my truck at 19 and didn't tell me for 3 weeks, didn't think I'd mind. When he took the camping gear from my garage without asking, didn't think I'd mind. When he borrowed $18,000 and then called 6 months later for more, somewhere in that thinking was the same calculus. Dad won't really mind. I said, I mind. What happened next is the part I think about most, because Garrett, my son, my only child, the boy I coached and drove and worried about and wrote checks for, looked at me with something that was not quite contempt, but was close enough that my stomach dropped. He looked at me the way you look at an inconvenience. He said, "We paid for groceries. We've been maintaining the place. It's not like we've been freeloading." Roberta from the kitchen doorway said something under her breath. I heard the word difficult. I said, "I'd like everyone to be out by tomorrow morning." Blythe made a sound. Thatcher set down his glass, my glass, and looked at me for the first time with open hostility. He said, "We drove 9 hours to get here. We've been here almost 2 weeks. You can't seriously expect," I said. "I'm not speaking to you." He blinked. I don't think anyone had said that to him in a long time. Garrett stepped forward. "Dad, come on, be reasonable. There are 7 people here. It's a 4-hour drive back to the cities for most of them. At least let everyone stay through the weekend. Let them drive back Sunday." "No," I said, just that. "No." And I watched my son's face do something I had never seen it do. It cycled through options: argue, negotiate, guilt, appeal. And when it came back around to the beginning, it landed on anger. He said, "You know what your problem is? You've been using this place to hide since Mom died. You come up here alone every year, and you sit with your grief and you don't let anyone in, and now you're standing there acting like we violated some sacred space when all we did was use a cabin that's been sitting empty for 11 months of the year." The room was very quiet. Blythe said his name softly. He ignored her. He said, "Mom would have wanted this place to be used. She would have wanted family here." I looked at my son for a long moment. He was using his mother's memory as leverage in an argument about a property he'd broken into and occupied without my knowledge. He knew it. I could see that he knew it. I said, "Your mother built the sunroom in this cabin. She chose every board. She planted those blueberry bushes by the dock. She is everywhere in this place, and you are standing in the middle of it using her name to avoid apologizing." Nobody said anything. "I want everyone out by 9 tomorrow morning," I said. "I'll be at the motel in town tonight. If you're not gone by 9, I'll make a phone call." Garrett said, "What phone call?" I didn't answer him. I went back out to my truck. I drove to the motel and I sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark. I called my attorney, a man named Weston I've known for 20 years, not to get advice, but just to hear a sensible voice. Weston asked me what I wanted to do. I said I wasn't sure yet. He said, "Call me tomorrow and let me know." I slept 4 hours. I drove back to the cabin at 8:45. The SUVs were gone. Thatcher's car was gone. The cabin was quiet in the way it gets when people have left in a hurry. A few things out of place, a dish in the drying rack, a throw blanket folded wrong on the couch. Garrett's Tahoe was still there. He was sitting at the kitchen table, just him. Coffee in front of him, hands wrapped around the mug. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He said, "I sent everyone else ahead." I sat down across from him. We didn't say anything for a moment. He said, "I know it was wrong." I waited. He said, "We've been underwater, Dad. Financially. The company restructured again, and I'm on a draw against commission that's basically nothing until the new territory builds up. And Blythe's parents were visiting, and they kept making comments about our house being too small. And he stopped. I wanted to give them something. I wanted to look like I had something. I understood this. I wished I didn't, but I understood it completely. I said, "How long has it been like this?" He told me, the full version, not the version he'd been giving me on the phone. They were behind on the mortgage by 3 months. The credit cards were maxed. They'd been borrowing from Blythe's parents, too, amounts he couldn't look at me when he said. The fertility treatments hadn't worked and they'd spent the $10,000, and they were both grieving that loss on top of everything else. I listened to all of it. When he was done, I said, "Garrett, I've given you somewhere around $70,000 in the past 3 years. He nodded. Not as gifts. I told myself they were loans. He nodded again. "Have you thought about how you pay any of that back?" he said. Not in any way that makes sense, which was honest at least. More honest than most of our conversations had been. I said, "I'm not going to give you any more money." He looked up. I said, "Not because I don't love you, because it hasn't helped. 3 years, $70,000, and you're sitting here 3 months behind on your mortgage. The money didn't solve anything. It just delayed the thing you're going to have to face eventually." He said, "Dad." I said, "I'm going to suggest something. You and Blythe need to talk to a financial counselor, a real one, not a friend's advice, not a podcast, a licensed counselor who can look at your numbers and help you make a plan. The NFCC has a hotline, nonprofit, free counseling. I'll send you the number." He looked at the table. "I'll also pay for 3 sessions with the marriage counselor because I think you two are carrying more than money stress and you need somewhere to put it. That's all I'm offering." "That's it? That's it?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the lake was flat and silver in the morning light. The blueberry bushes were finished for the season, just bare sticks along the dock. He said, "What about the cabin?" I said, "What about it?" "It's just going to sit here." "It's mine," I said. "I'll decide what I do with it." He said, "That's not," and stopped himself. I said, "What were you going to say?" He shook his head. I said, "Garrett, say it." He said quietly, "I was going to say that's not fair, but I know it is. I know it's yours." I know I had no right. He put his hands flat on the table. "I think I've spent the last 4 years convincing myself that because you have more than you need, that made it okay to take some of it. And that's not the kind of man I want to be." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Your mother was better at knowing when to hold on and when to let go. I'm not as good at it, but I've been thinking about it a lot these past few years. And I think the kindest thing I can do for you, the thing that's actually on your side, not just comfortable for me, is to stop catching you." He didn't say anything. He was crying a little, quietly, the way grown men do when they're trying not to. I said, "I love you. That doesn't change. But love isn't a blank check, and I should have understood that a long time ago." We sat there together for another hour. We didn't solve everything. You don't solve everything in one conversation. He drove out around 10:30, and I stood on the dock and watched the Tahoe disappear around the bend in the road, and then I stood there a while longer and listened to the lake. There's a particular sound water makes in September in northern Minnesota, a stillness that isn't quite silence, looms somewhere across the water, the creak of the dock, the aspens whispering. Dolores used to say the lake sounded like it was thinking. I stayed 2 weeks, like I always do. I fished every morning. I read on the sunroom porch in the afternoons. I changed the entry code. Garrett called the NFCC. He texted me to tell me so 3 weeks later. Just made the appointment. "Thank you." I texted back, "Good. Let me know how it goes." And I meant it. There's a thing that happens when you finally stop doing the thing you've been doing out of love but not wisdom. It doesn't feel the way you expect. I thought it would feel like relief, or righteous, or maybe like grief. It felt more like setting down something heavy that you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of you. Your shoulders straighten. You breathe differently. I don't know what Garrett will make of his life from here. I'm not going to pretend I do. But for the first time in a long time, that's his question to answer, not mine to solve with a wire transfer and a hope. That feels right. It took me longer than it should have to understand that it could. The blueberry bushes will come back in the spring. They always do. I've been thinking about what it actually costs to rescue someone who doesn't know they're drowning. When I look back at those 3 years of wire transfers, the thing that strikes me isn't the dollar amount. Those $70,000 is not a number I say lightly. It's that every time I sent money, I told myself I was solving a problem, and every time, within a few months, a new problem appeared, slightly larger, slightly more urgent. The calls came faster, not slower. That pattern was telling me something I didn't want to hear. There's a version of love that looks generous but is actually afraid. Afraid of watching someone you care about struggle. Afraid of feeling like you could have helped and didn't. I was operating from that fear for a long time, and I dressed it up as generosity so I didn't have to examine it too closely. That's not wisdom. That's comfort, wearing the costume of kindness. What I did to Garrett, what I kept doing year after year, was remove the consequences of his choices before he ever had to fully feel them. He overspent. I covered it. He made a bad financial decision. I absorbed the damage. He never got to the moment where the numbers don't work and there's nowhere left to turn except inward, toward himself, toward real change. I kept stealing that moment from him because watching him reach it would have been painful for me. That's the part that took me a while to sit with, honestly. My generosity was, in some real measure, self-serving. I was buying my own comfort. The discomfort of watching my son fail was something I couldn't tolerate, and so I made sure he didn't have to fail. And in doing so, I made sure he couldn't fully grow either. Entir isn't just about honesty with other people. It's about honesty with yourself, about why you do what you do. I had to look at my own motives and admit that some of what I called love was actually avoidance. That's a hard thing to see when you're in it. The morning Garrett sat across from me at that kitchen table and said, "I know I had no right." That was the first honest conversation we'd had in years. He wasn't performing remorse or calculating his next ask. He was sitting with the actual weight of what he'd become, and for the first time, I wasn't rushing in to lift it off him. Resilience isn't something you can give a person. You can't wire transfer someone a spine. It builds in the gap between the problem and the rescue, in the hours and days where a person has to figure something out themselves, has to sit with discomfort long enough to develop a response to it. Every time I closed that gap with a check, I closed it before Garrett could build anything in it. I'm not sure I'd do everything differently. I don't think regret is a useful place to live. But I know what I understand now that I didn't then. The most courageous thing a parent can sometimes do is stay in their chair. Let the silence be silent. Trust that the person you raised has more in them than you've been giving them credit for, and that you'll never find out if you keep proving them right by showing up to save them. The blueberry bushes come back every spring. They don't need me to do anything. They just need me to leave them alone.